This is talk number 38, and let's begin with prayer. Lord, again today we come with a keen sense of our dependence on you. We remember that Jesus opened the minds of the disciples so that they might understand the scriptures of Israel, and that he opened the scriptures to them. And we don't know quite what that means, Lord, but we know that we want to be in on that opening, that understanding. Help us, Lord, as we read this passage in Leviticus, which is so very distant from us. Help us, Lord, to be able to move in some adequate way back into that world and to understand what you intended for your people and ultimately what you intend for us. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. If you have your Bibles, and I know you're religious people, so you brought your Bibles with you, turn with me to Leviticus chapter 6. And if you have one or other of the versions of the notes, I'm going to try to follow the text pretty carefully. And I hate to do this. I'm going to read it. I think I said to you off camera last week, and I'm going to say to the camera people so they'll know. In the last 10, 15 years of my life as a university teacher, I never stood up and lectured. I always sat down and talked with students about notes they had read. So I find this a very awkward and somewhat, just an awkward experience standing up and lecturing, because I know, and you won't repeat this comment outside this room, that next to preaching, which is absolutely awful in terms of communication, lecturing is the next most awful thing. And the best thing is to sit around a fireplace with a copy of C.S. Lewis and a large cup of tea, and everybody having read the book, Till We Have Faces would be a nice one, and then you spend 3 hours digesting it together, right? Now that's what I would call an intelligent and useful piece of education. And I actually ran a class like that many, many years ago, and that's my idea of pedagogy, is sitting down with a maximum of 10 people. 6 would be better, but the administration doesn't like small classes, so you have to have at least 10 to make it pay. And with people who've read it beforehand, and you talk about it. And so this is certainly subprime teaching, and I know that, and I'm aware of the fact that you know it. Leviticus 6, 1 through 7, I'm not going to read the text for sake of time. We will read it a little bit later inside the text. I hope you've read it. If you're watching on camera, let me ask you to stop the thing and go and read Leviticus 6, 1 through 7, then turn it back on and follow along so you have the text in your head. I want to ask about the relation now of this text in Leviticus 6, 1 through 7, and I'm going to do a little bit of drawing this morning. This is the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, and of course it's repeated in Deuteronomy later. And then this is the Book of the Covenant, which is Exodus 20 through 23 in rough terms. And today I'm going to suggest that the 8th commandment about stealing, which we've seen in the Book of the Covenant in chapter 22, 1 through 17, is now going to be brought across in Leviticus. And I'm going to draw Leviticus up here to start with. Brought across in Leviticus chapter 6. And stealing is also dealt with here. But the new element is that the 3rd commandment, which is about swearing and about false swearing, comes across. Now, we do have an element of swearing here. You take an oath to say that when you come before God or the judges, I didn't steal it. You swear. We read about that last week, didn't we? Now, what's going to happen this week is that it comes across over here, and what we have this 3 times exactly in the Hebrew, false swearing. Twice in Leviticus 6 and once in Leviticus 19, which is a parallel passage. So Leviticus brings together, which the Book of the Covenant doesn't do, stealing and swearing, but the new element is false. So we have a very well-honed case study here of false swearing. What happens when someone steals something from a neighbor and then later changes their mind, apparently, repents, confesses, and then how do you deal with that kind of situation. And that seems to be what we have at this point. So the relation of Leviticus 6, 1 through 7 to 22, 21 I've outlined, and the same here with 20 verse 7. Let me just start with note 2 here. The link or reference back to Exodus 20 verse 7 by Leviticus 6 is twofold. First, the obvious link to false swearing, the misuse of the name of the Lord, whosoever uses his name. We develop the false swearing below, but also note the rather obvious link between the multiple occurrences of guilt in Leviticus 6, 1 through 7, and guiltless of chapter 20, verse 7. Let me read it to you. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. That would be the false swearing. So when you swore that you hadn't taken the possession, you swear in the name of Yahweh, and so it's a misuse of the name of Yahweh. So that's the false swearing part. Then it says, for the Lord will not hold anyone nakwa, guiltless, who misuses his name. So in this, we have not the word guilt, but we have the opposite of it. I'm not quite sure it's the antonym, but guilt and guiltless. Maybe that is an antonym, but it's the other end of the pole. And if you falsely swear, you'll not be held guiltless. Or I would suppose that really means you'll be held guilty. But it doesn't say that. All right? And I'm going to be very careful about terms today. You'll probably think I'm too fastidious, but I'm just trying to be careful about the terms. Put the other way around, for the Lord will hold guilty anyone who misuses his name. Probably the right thing. So this direct reference to both the third and the eighth commandment is obvious in Leviticus 19 and 11, which we will also read a little bit later. Now, this is not the place to develop a full-blown study of the concept of guilt using synonyms and antonyms. But having said that, we're certainly very, very interested in guilt, because in the Star of Justice, and I hope you haven't forgotten the Star of Justice, in the Star of Justice, which we'll talk about today, at the forensic level, when the judge pronounces people, he either pronounces them acquitted or he pronounces them condemned. You're either innocent or you're guilty. So guilty is a key term in justice talk. And it's Leviticus 6, actually Leviticus 4 through 6, where the gravity of guilt really is found in the book of in the law of Moses. If you want to talk about guilt, you look at Leviticus 4 through 6, and we're going to look especially at chapter 6. So it's guilt here, and I'm going to spend most of our time today talking about guilt. So this is not the place to develop it, but I will do a little bit. But we briefly note that nakwa, guiltless, also occurs in Exodus 21:19 about a master striking his slave. The master is guiltless. The NIV renders it not responsible. We're not going to find today that the translations, especially the NIV, are not consistent. All right? Blessed are those who read Hebrew, for they shall find the secret meanings. The only problem is that most of us don't read Hebrew, do we? Yeah, and so we're going to have to be careful and look at these things. But I've tried to give you the codes for these so you can at least follow along. The master is guiltless if the slave gets up after a day or two after beating. Now, if the slave dies, the master is put to death, which implies that he is guilty, although the term is not used. So there's an element of in the book of the covenant, you do have a statement of guiltless here, although there won't be any use of the word guilt. I'm coming to that, all right? Furthermore, nakwa also occurs in Exodus 34:7, and its parallel in Numbers 14:18. In a text we've already considered in connection with the third commandment statement about punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation, which occurs in both the third commandment of the Ten Commandments and in Exodus 34:7. Exodus 34:7 not only refers to punishment of children, but also it uses nakwa. Now let me read the passage to you. I'm just picking a piece out here. Maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Now we're going to come back and do a major study of this passage in about 5 or 6 weeks. Exodus 25 through 40 is all about the tabernacle. You're going along very nicely, getting the tabernacle set up, and right smack dab in the middle of that is Exodus 32 through 34. And it's the story of the golden calves. And they're still at Mount Sinai. In fact, Moses still may be getting the Ten Commandments, all right? And the editor puts that story right in the middle of all these detailed descriptions about the curtains. And you say, oh, how's that work? Well, we'll come back and think about that. But that little passage is where we're reading from, and this is sort of the condensation of everything you're supposed to learn from that passage. So I'm breaking into it. We'll come back and look at it in detail because it's a very important passage. Maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. And they had just done the golden calves, right? And God forgives them. Yet, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Now let me make 2 comments here that are not necessarily connected. The first one is you have the love of God that forgives, and yet it doesn't remove punishment. Huh? You have the love of God that forgives, but it doesn't remove punishment. Now we're going to have to come back and think about that, aren't we? Because that's not really quite where our theology probably is. But it's clearly what the tensions are in the text, the polarities of the text, if you like that word. Now, more to the point today, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. The word guilty, asham, the basic word for guilty, is not there. What you do have, though, is the other word for guiltless. Twice. So it's a very complicated piece of Hebrew. And he says, guiltless, not guiltless. I will not leave them cleared, is the translation of many of them. I won't clear them of this. So he punishes the children and their children and their next children down for the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. The difficulty is that the Hebrew contains the verb naqua twice with a negative between the two. Naqua is a verb that can have the sense of to clear, that is, one is cleared of guilt, one is pronounced guiltless. The NRSV has yet no means clearing the guilty, as do others. Because he does not clear them, he punishes the children. The reference to naqua in Exodus 34:7 no doubt goes back to the naqua of Exodus 20 verse 7, because it's quoting that text, I will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. And we've already mentioned this is the golden calf instance. Now, one more comment on naqua, and I'm going to quit on that. That's the guiltless word. Finally, naqua is used 3 times in Numbers 5, 19, 28, 31 in the passage about the law of jealousy, about a jealous husband asking his wife undergo the bitter waters and curses, the curse testing to show that she had not slept with another man. I don't know if we'll come back and work on that passage or not. That's a very difficult passage. So the word naqua occurs 8 times in the law. And I've picked up some of them. There's one here, and we have some in Numbers, and we have some down here in Exodus 34, which is repeated in Numbers 18. So there are not a lot of references to guiltless. There are a few, and they're strategic, but not a lot of them. Now, what I really want to focus on is the word for guilt. And so we come now to Leviticus 6, 1 through 7, which is part of a much larger context. We must not isolate Leviticus 6, 1 through 7 from its broader context. Leviticus 1 through 6 is a discussion about the varied offerings that are to be made in the tabernacle. Without trying to spell out the varied sacrifices and their function in this context, we observe that Leviticus 4 through 6, 7 deals with the issue of guilt and how to achieve forgiveness through a sacrifice which makes atonement. Leviticus 4 deals with the guilt in connection with sins of priests, the whole community, a leader, a member of the community. Then Leviticus 5 and following spells out in detail some of the sins that a community member may be guilty of. He may be guilty of failing to stand up and to be a testimony, to give testimony in a trial, and we will come back and look at that much later. He may be guilty of uncleanness, and I'm not going to go there with you, but it's just interesting that Leviticus brings together what we would consider to be morality and ritual. That is, you shall not commit murder, and then the next sentence says, and don't eat this kind of meat. And we'll come back and look at that at another time. So here you have guilt for uncleanness, guilt for thoughtlessly taking an oath to do anything, guilt in general, and then guilt for sins that are unintentionally committed, guilt for breaking any of the commandments, and then finally, the last piece is our piece, guilt for stealing and lying about the stealing under oath. So the piece we're going to look at is sort of the climax of the guilt section. And let me say again, if you're doing a study on guilt in the Old Testament, you will look up the concordance and immediately you'll find that the guilt passages are in Leviticus 4 through 6. That's where guilt comes from. Now, I think it's worth the blood, sweat, and tears to work on this a bit, because guilt and justice and atonement and forgiveness are right at the heart of the story later on, aren't they? And if I can step outside the story and just tell you, I have a stack of at least 10 books. I collect books, I don't read them, but I have a stack of at least 10 books on atonement theory, many by evangelicals. And you will know that the atonement theory has been put back up for grabs again in many evangelical circles. And I think the way to get to the answer to that is to start within the story and read within the story and pay attention to how the story conceives of matters like atonement and guilt. Now the layout, and here we're going to read the text. I will read it slowly and you can follow along. I use indentation to help us see where we're going. The Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful, and the Hebrew here is ma'al ma'al, to the Lord. So we've got a new slant here, unfaithful to the Lord. In the book of the covenant, it's unfaithful to each other. But with Leviticus, we get something new, unfaithfulness to the Lord. Now, it's not just that, as we'll see, but that's at the front. And how are you unfaithful? By deceiving his neighbor about something entrusted to him. So it's that section in the book of the covenant called safekeeping, which is actually the longest section of the piece on stealing, where you give something to the neighbor and it goes missing. So it's in that long section about safekeeping that these things come up. So you've lent it to the neighbor, and you've deceived the neighbor about something entrusted to him, or left in his care, or stolen. If he cheats him, or if he finds lost property and lies about it, or if he swears falsely. Now that's the crux term here. Or if he commits any other sin that people do, and obviously catchphrase, when he thus sins and becomes, and here it comes, becomes guilty. He becomes guilty. He's asham. What does he do then? He must return what he has stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to him, or the lost property he found, or whatever it was he swore falsely about. And there's that phrase, the second time. We have it one more time in Leviticus 19:11, 12, and 13. So then he must make, and here restitution comes in. We had restitution in the book of the covenant, and Leviticus picks that up and brings that across too, our key idea of shalom, restitution. He must make restitution in full and add a fifth of the value to it and give it all to the owner on the day he presents his guilt offering. So here we get into Leviticus. If you're guilty, you need to have a guilt offering, an offering to deal with the guilt. And as a penalty, and I will come back and work on that word, he must bring to the priest, that is to the Lord, his guilt offering. A ram from the flock, one without defect, one of proper value. Now what will happen? In this way, the priest will make atonement, kafar, for him before the Lord, and he will be forgiven for any of these things that he has done that made him guilty. So at least 4 times in here we have the idea in English of guilt. You can see the Hebrew terms vary a bit between the verb and between a noun that's feminine and a noun that's masculine. I don't know why guilt is masculine sometimes and feminine sometimes. Maybe it was equality of the sexes. I have no idea why these things vary. And he winds up being guilty. Now, observation on the layout. The sins are articulated in verses 2 and 3 and repeated with slight variation 4 and 5. The most important observation is that the phrase marked with an asterisk, if he swears falsely, occurs in both statements of the sin expression. The same expression, as we've already said, is found in Leviticus 19:12. Now, summary of the text. Can we give a little short summary because we're going to get lost, and before we get lost, maybe we can get found, all right? In short, the text says that if a person is unfaithful to the Lord, and he becomes unfaithful by swearing falsely in an oath before the Lord about something stolen from a neighbor. Are you with me? That's what the text is about. It's a very, very specific case. And he stole it by extortion, failure to return lost property, cheating, etc. He must restore what has been stolen by a restitution made, first of all, to the neighbor that equals 120% of the value of the stolen object, and secondly, by presenting to the priest a guilt offering for the Lord, a ram, which will make atonement, resulting in forgiveness. Right? So, I mean, the idea of the passage is fairly straightforward and fairly simple. Some of the details are less straightforward and less simple. Lying in an oath about stealing that renders one unfaithful to the Lord. The translations vary in their rendering of ma'al, which occurs twice here, once in the verb form and once in the noun form. Hebrew, like many other languages, creates emphasis by repetition. The NIV has unfaithful to the Lord. The King James and others have trespass against the Lord. The RSV has breach of faith against the Lord. The ma'al against the Lord is lying in an oath about something stolen, something found and not returned. Now, the acts of stealing, which are linked to not telling truth. First of all, the acts of lying. And we've already looked at these, but let me just slow down and say it again. The act of lying are described in 3 different ways, and I put them in italics: by deceiving the neighbor, by telling him things that aren't true, by if he lies about the property that was lost, and then the key phrase, if he swears falsely. So the acts of lying are expressed in 3 ways, and I've given those to you. Now, I've quoted down here, and you can see the quotation, Leviticus 19, 11, and 12. And let me just read the quotation to you. I've indented part of it. Do not steal. Do not lie. And you can see Leviticus 19 picking up the 10 Commandments and rearranging them, all right, and in between them, sandwiching ideas in about cleanness. And we will get to Leviticus 19 by and by, and I will use Leviticus as the hinge about moving from the law to holiness and the 4 or 5 major sets of way you keep things holy. Cleanness law is one of them. Haram, the destruction of people, is another one. Sabbath is another one, and we'll come back and deal with that at a much later date. But I will use Leviticus 19 as a hinge text. But it's a fascinating piece because it picks up all 10 of the 10 Commandments with maybe one exception, rearranges them, puts in between them statements about purity and holiness. And here we have this one: do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. That's commandment number 3, which we've already heard in Leviticus 6. Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back wages of a hired man. So Leviticus is very, very carefully knit together. Stealing lying, stealing. Do you see that? It's just really very tight. And so this is a case of stealing in which involves perjury or lying. Bottom of the page, the practice of swearing an oath before a god in the above matters was common in the ancient Near East. It's not peculiar to the Bible. We have already encountered this in the BC, where the NIV obscures the rendering Elohim as judges, but all the other translations have before God. You will come before God. You will come before Elohim and swear, and there will be a decision made. So it's in that kind of context that we're working out all this. Now the acts of stealing. The acts of stealing, and I'm going to do this a little bit more in detail, are deceit about goods given to a neighbor for safekeeping. And we've talked about that. The deceit would be saying that the item was stolen by someone else or lost when in fact the neighbor had stolen it himself. Cheating, which could be a matter of false weights. The law certainly talks about that. Finding lost property, which belonged to a neighbor, not returning it. And if he commits any such sin that people do. So there's a whole range of stealing here. In light of the catch-all statement, this list does not exhaust the varied kinds of stealing. Lending money at interest to a needy neighbor would have been considered in the law as yet another form of stealing. We'll come to that eventually. As is the delay in paying wages considered to be stealing. We've already touched on that once. Now, guilt, the result of swearing falsely about stealing. And here you want to fasten at least one safety belt, and I will go slowly and we can talk our way through this. Guilt and its place within forensic justice and the broader concept of justice. So I'm going to add to this, if I can find my pen, the business about standard and about conduct and then about retributive justice and then about distributive justice or restorative justice with, of course, fairness in the middle. So we've got our 6 facets, the 5 points, and the fairness in the middle. When he thus sins and becomes guilty, asham, this clause introduces, I suggest, new vocabulary of asham and possibly a new concept of guilt. And I'm going to nuance this, but I think it probably introduces, I'm sure it introduces new vocabulary, you can see that. And I think the concept of guilt actually comes at this point. At least the positive statement of the concept of guilt comes in Leviticus 6. All right? And I'm going to make a point to that, so just hang on. Therefore, we must explore as best we can the precise sense of guilt in this context, given that guilt is a major facet of forensic justice, which is one of the 5 points of the larger star of justice. The judge, in such a case, all right, assesses the conduct of the accused by the standard of justice and either pronounces the accused innocent or acquitted or condemned or guilty. All right? So I'm working these sides of it. So the judge looks at the conduct of the person, measures it by the standard, and then makes a pronouncement. All right? And then things happen on the other side of the equation. If the accused is found guilty, then the person is punished. But in this case and others, no direct mention of punishment or penalty, except the NIV, and I'll come back to that, is made. And we talked about that last week. And Leviticus carries on the same idea, that penalty and punishment are not to the fore. In fact, they may not be there at all. Rather, the thief is required to make restitution. Are you with me? I mean, I hope you can smell the fuse burning on this stick of dynamite, can you? I mean, we haven't tried to apply it, but my goodness, if this is true. Rather, the thief is required to make restitution to the victim and to bring a guilt offering to the Lord via the priest. And I say this carefully, the Lord is also a victim. We got 2 victims here. Restitution is a matter of distributive or restorative justice. You're restoring something. Now, it may be that the act of restoring is also punitive. I don't deny that. But it's just interesting that that's not the way it's framed. We have already suggested that the focal point of this kind of justice is the restoration of the victim and the broken relationship with the neighbor and the Lord, so that there might be shalom or peace in the community. Now, the text doesn't actually say that exactly, but it certainly seems to be moving that way. Why do you offer restitution? Well, to restore the victim, to bring them back to where they were. Why do you offer the guilt offering to God? I mean, he doesn't need to be restored, does he? I mean, God's pretty big, and if you kick him, he gets on pretty well, doesn't he? Yeah, I mean, are we restoring God to something that he lost? Now, I know God says you robbed me, and I understand that human speech, but God's not being restored. So what is it we're restoring with God? Surely it must be relationship. And so I would have thought the force of the passage is to do justice so as to restore right relations in community, both between the neighbor and between the offender and God who he's offended. So it's about restoring relations. What is new here in the law of Leviticus is that stealing is not only an offense against the neighbor, but also an offense against God, especially given that the Lord's name was used in vain. We don't have that kind of talk in the Ten Commandments, really, or in the Book of the Covenant. It doesn't go that way. It's talking about interpersonal relationships. Given that guilt is such a major term in justice in general and forensic justice in particular, we shall give some detailed attention to both the vocabulary and the concept. What follows is a bit difficult, so fasten your safety belt. I've warned you. Asham and related terms that speak of guilt in connection with the law are introduced in Leviticus. We observe that Asham and Ashem vocabulary for guilt first occur in a narrative context. Genesis 20. One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us, says Abimelech to Abraham about Sarah. Do you remember that story? And then Genesis 42, they, the brothers of Joseph, said to one another, in truth we are guilty concerning our brother Joseph, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he besought us, and we would not listen. Therefore, in this distress has come upon us. But after this initial occurrence of these two terms in a narrative context, the family of Hebrew words, Asham, Ashama, Ashem, Asham, do not occur in the scriptures of Israel until Leviticus 4. They're not in the Ten Commandments. They're not in the Book of the Covenant. You've got to hang on until you get all the way into Leviticus to get guilt. Leviticus 4:3 says, where Asham is used, bring guilt on the people is the first occurrence. And I've written out these other occurrences. I'm not going to read them all to you for sake of time. Let me read the last line. What is noteworthy is that none of these terms is used in the Ten Commandments or in the Book of the Covenant. So we've had a lot of discussion about very fundamental law without discussing guilt. And it's not until we get to Leviticus that the concept of guilt comes to the fore. Now, concept of guilt not emphasized in the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant, and really not prominent later in the law. And I'm going to look through these words here. Please brace yourself for a couple pages. We need to remind ourselves that the concept of guilt is not necessarily limited to one Hebrew word or one family of words, asham. Other words, synonyms, some in English translations are rendered as guilt, and there are antonyms such as guiltless, which we consider briefly above. Briefly, now I'm going to look at now let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the places in the NIV where the word guilt occurs in this section and try to show you that in each case it's a mistranslation of the text, all right? That guilt is not really there, that they've read it into the text. Exodus 22:2, the NIV says, and they're not alone in this, supplies guilt in Exodus 22:3. He is guilty of bloodshed. But other major English translations do not supply the word guilt. They read no blood, King James, or blood guiltlessness, ASV, RSV, etc. The Hebrew literally reads, there shall be blood for him. And the translators say, if there's blood for him, then he has to be guilty. But they've extrapolated that. They've stretched that. You don't actually find it in the text. Exodus 22:9, same kind of thing. The one whom the judges declare guilty, Rasha, must pay back double to his neighbor. All the other translations render the verb Rasha as condemn, the one whom God condemns. The issue is deciding if Rasha, in this particular context, is speaking of condemning or the result of condemning. Now that may seem like hair splitting, and I suspect it may be hair splitting. But you can see the difference in translations. NIV will say guilt, the result of condemning. The other translations all say condemning. 23:7. Along the same lines, Exodus 23:7 in NIV and others reads, for I will not acquit the guilty. All the other translations have wicked. Again, the issue is to decide if Rasha, in this particular context, is speaking about the wicked, what the person is, or about the guilt, what the person is as a result of being wicked. In both Exodus 22:9 and 23:7, the line between what a person is and what a person is as a result of the wickedness is difficult, if at all possible, to draw. The concept of guilt may be present in the above text, but it's not clearly present. All right? It's not clearly present. Now, Exodus 34:7. I've already looked at this, so for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over it. You can read it. And I simply say here, Exodus 34:7, it says, I will not clear them by any means. And it uses the word guiltless twice. It doesn't use the word guilty. It says guiltless, not guiltless. That is, they will not be accounted as guiltless for this sin. There will be punishment that follows it. All right? Now, summary at the bottom of the page, 5 that I'm following. The vocabulary asham and its related words do not occur in the Hebrew text in the law. They do occur in Genesis, but in the law they don't occur until Leviticus 4. Or put the other way around, asham and its related words do not occur in the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant. All right? So that has to do with the vocabulary. There's not too much argument about that. Asham occurs here, which is guilt, guilt offering, guilty. It doesn't occur here, it doesn't occur here. It occurs way out here in Genesis in that narrative, but it's not part of the law talk. Now the concept of guilt, which is far more complicated, of course. The concept of guilt, represented by other words in some English translations, does not occur at all in the Ten Commandments or the Book of the Covenant if you're reading in the right translation. And in those English translations where guilt or guilty does occur, it is not clear that this is the preferred rendering. This means that if one is reading in the NIV, the term guilt occurs 3 times in the Book of the Covenant. If one is reading in the RSV or the ESV, it does not occur at all. Almost all readers of the English translation will encounter guilty outside of the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 34:7. But there it's actually guiltless and not guilt in a positive sense. But even here the term is supplied and does not represent a specific Hebrew word for guilt, asham. On the other hand, the term nakwa, which is the term guiltless, to render guiltless, does occur in the Ten Commandments, in the Book of the Covenant, and in Exodus 34. Now, if you're not completely gassed by that, I will try to draw a conclusion, and you will see that there's some payoff, at least I think there is, conclusion. First, the new vocabulary about guilt associated with the asham family of words first occurs in the law at Leviticus 4 in connection with the guilt offering and is prominent in Leviticus 6, 1-7. And depending on on the translation that one reads, it could be that this is not only a matter of new vocabulary being introduced into the law, but also a new concept. I am inclined to think that in Leviticus 4 through 6, we have both new vocabulary, that's fairly clear, and a new concept being introduced into the law. But we must be careful because the line between wicked and guilty as a result of being wicked perhaps is not sharply maintained in biblical thought, and we have yet to explore it in any real significant detail. Now I've lost my place here. Guiltless, which occurs in the third commandment. On the other hand, the term nakwa, to clear, to render guiltless, does occur in the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant and in Exodus 34, in that very important text, which refers back to Exodus 20. So after Leviticus, now I'm thinking about what comes after it, nakwa is used in the case of the jealous husband, but I would maintain that the concept of guilt is not prominent in the Ten Commandments or the Book of the Covenant. And I find this instructive. Now let me just simply say in very simple language. You don't find positive statements of guilt up here. You do here. What you find here at best is guiltless. But it's interesting that you can come all the way to Leviticus in the law before you get any real talk about guilt. Now, let me step outside of the story for a second and say, I find that rather jarring because as a modern, thinking of jurisprudence, what comes to your mind, especially if you read detective stories or watch them, is who's guilty, right? We're occupied with guilt. I want to suggest that the law is not occupied with guilt. Does it have guilt? Yes. Is that the central piece? I don't think so. Just like we're occupied with prisons, but there are no prisons in the law. So getting our way back into the world of the text, it at least raises some questions about what justice is in that setting. Now, second, I am sure you must feel slightly exhausted after reading the last page or two and wonder if why I've made such a detailed study of the occurrences of guilt. In part, I have pursued this because in certain streams of our modern thinking about the law, we often associate the primary function of the law, and here I'm talking about the biblical law, but it could be just secular law, that the primary function of the law with guilt. The law brings about guilt. The law shows us we're guilty. We have heard famous evangelists tell us that the law is a mirror into which we look and we see ourselves as guilty. And of course the law does, as Leviticus 6, 1 through 7 clearly state, speak of guilt for lying in an oath about stealing. But the lack of the vocabulary and concept of guilt in both the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant surely is instructive, as is also the infrequency of the term for guilt in Numbers and Deuteronomy. In the footnotes, I've chased some of those. You'll see that. Therefore, I suggest for your consideration that the primary function of the law, when one reads within the story and does not read back into the story from a later stage in the story, ideas about the function of the law that we've gleaned from Paul, you with me? Is not to show us how sinful and therefore how guilty we are. The law's primary function, reading within the story, is to structure a just society of the people of God, called Israel at this stage of the story, which will be a witness to the surrounding nations via its just social shape of the character of Yahweh himself. All right? Or put a bit differently, the function of the law is positive. That is, to help in the construction and maintenance of a just society. When the law is broken, there is guilt. A secondary function of the law is indeed to show one their guilt. The guilt can be dealt with via a guilt offering so that Israelites can go forward in their lives in a just community. If it is correct that the primary function of the law within the story at this stage is to structure and to maintain a just society, then it will not be difficult if later in the story we hear an actor in the story say that he delights in the law, which for most of us is just incomprehensible because we started the story at the wrong end. And by starting the story at the wrong end, by the time we get to the right end, we've gotten such a bad taste in our mouth about the law that we think that the primary function of the law is a mirror to tell us we're guilty, when in fact there really isn't any solid linguistic or conceptual evidence for that until we get all the way down here in a very small patch on Leviticus. Okay. Well, I can see you're thinking about that. So am I. Perhaps one other observation is in order, and I'm going to stop after this, that we are talking about the function of the law within the story. There is no hint within the story that if one keeps the law, that one will go to heaven. Right? No hint in the story if you keep the law, you go to heaven. This, of course, is called legalism. You know that. Some systems of Bible interpretation have read legalism, that idea, back into the story. It utterly fails to recognize that for the Israelites at this stage of the story, there was no heaven. Right? Pastor Bob's gone. No, he's gone. So I can say this carefully. You won't quote me outside class. I want to keep my membership in the church for a few more weeks. Right? That is, I mean, if you say to Abraham, "Brother, are you saved and going to heaven?" And he would say, "Saved. Yeah, the Mennonites came and I got away from them," or something. Or the Ammonites. Wasn't the Mennonites, was it? And one of those ites came and I was saved by Yahweh from them by a great battle and going to heaven. Is that north or south of Jerusalem? You know, where is? I don't think I've been to heaven. Not on the map that I can find. The concept of resurrection, which is the presupposition of going to heaven, isn't it? The concept of resurrection from the dead does not occur in Scriptures until the book of Daniel, chapter 12. In hindsight, we might be able to read a few verses in Job and Isaiah and Psalms in a way that speak of an afterlife, but clearly within the Pentateuch, where we are, there is no expectation within the story as it is told that there is a life after death. Hence, it is meaningless to talk about keeping the law in order to go to heaven. One kept the law in order to please the Lord and in order to live an orderly, just, and prosperous life in the here and now, which I think is the point of Leviticus 18:15. This does not mean that much later in the story there were those who misunderstood the function of the law and thought that by keeping it they might gain status. But even then the status that was sought was status in the eyes of human, not God. Matthew 6, right? The Pharisees are not seeking to get to heaven by keeping the law. Matthew doesn't have any hint of legalism. They're wanting to gain status not in the eyes of God, but they want the applause of man. Go read Matthew 6 again. Only in some of the letters of Paul, mainly Galatians, do we for the first time encounter the problem of keeping the law to gain status merit with God, which clearly is legalism. So it's there. Much later we shall return to all this, but it is surely instructive to understand the function of the law from within the story at this stage of the story itself. I just find that helpful because there's a whole theme, community, school of interpretation that when they read the law and Israel says, "Oh Lord, we will keep it," they throw up their hands and they say, "What a terrible mistake." They've become legalists. And I just think reading within the story, that's exegetically an impossible statement. It just doesn't work. There's no heaven to get to. And so what are we talking about legalism? So that the law, I would say again, is a positive thing to structure a just society, as a secondary function, it does deal with guilt. But even there, it's a fairly low-key dealing with guilt. And then thirdly, I would say, whatever else the law is, it's certainly not a 10-rung stepladder by which you climb up to heaven by your own merit. That's just quite unthinkable.